And just take you through, and this will be, I should say, a quick romp through my slides. And so just trying to get this into slideshow. Here we go. And I'll try and be succinct, and I will skip over a few things. Can people see those slides?
We can see them, Grant, yes.
You can, okay. So look, there's a bit of preamble which I'll skip, but just in terms of the structure, I want to talk a little bit, although I probably don't have time now, about where we were before the pandemic hit. The case for more timely and relevant indicators, some of the opportunities and challenges around that, and where we go next. And this is from the point of view of the Office of National Statistics and working as an analyst and economist in government, but really is also in part my personal reflections, including my experiences leading the ONS COVID response in the first few months of the pandemic. One of the things that's important to be aware is we didn't have a good global financial crisis. We kind of missed the key turning points back in 2008, and there were some reflections on that. We did a number of things to improve the timeliness and quality of our national accounts. One of the things which proved really valuable this pandemic has been to publish our monthly GDP series, which meant that within 7 weeks, we knew that there'd been a large fall in output in March, and within 11 weeks, we got the full extent of that with a decline of around 20.4% of preliminary estimates. In April, much faster than occurred in the previous recession, and also much faster than other national statistical institutes which rely on quarterly GDP data. So although that's not really a real-time indicator, it's certainly much more timely official statistics and has proven really invaluable in plotting the progress of the economy over the course of the COVID pandemic. Now, in addition, though, I think there's a real challenge, and Tim Harford expresses it well, about the fact we have all this big data, what are we doing with it, and why isn't it being reflected in better statistics? And it was a good challenge. We also, in 2016, had the Bean Review, and that talked in particular around the need to exploit alternative sources of information and take advantage of the new data sources that were out there, alongside modernising and improving our existing suite of statistics. And that was also led to a major work program across the ONS. But in terms of where we were just before the pandemic struck, we'd set up the Data Science Campus, and we started to construct a monthly bulletin of real-time indicators focusing on things like shipping visits. We'd also set up the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, ESCoE, and had launched quite an ambitious research program across a wide range of economic statistics, working with the academic community. And we've done a number of other things to improve the statistics, including admin data such as VAT, trade statistics, and investigating scanner data and other sources of alternative price data. And then finally, we were working pre-pandemic, which proved to be helpful with 2 major financial institutions, which kind of set us up nicely to actually build on those relationships when the pandemic hit. Then, of course, along came COVID, the lockdown last March. I was asked to head a rapid response group to try and plug some of the data gaps and evidence gaps that were emerging in response to this crisis. For example, nobody had any estimates of social distancing. Nobody had any estimates on a whole range of things. So what do we do initially? Well, like everyone else, we work from home. We managed to do that quite quickly and with secure VPN set up. That hasn't been the experience across government, but it was relatively minimal disruption. We had to stand down a whole bunch of surveys, including labour force survey and local price collection, which accounts for 80% of price quotes and 40% of the CPI basket, and find alternative ways of collecting that data. And as I said, we set up cross-ONS coordination, the rapid response group, daily calls with key people across the organisation, deprioritise some outputs so we could free up staff to address the COVID response. And we were providing daily Cabinet Office briefing across a wide range of metrics, including some that we obtained through the Data Science Campus team working on web scraping and other sources to try and provide real-time information. And as the IMF have rightly pointed out, the pandemic, not just here in the UK, but across many countries, has really accelerated this drive to develop new real-time indicators to sit alongside traditional statistics, which just weren't timely enough or weren't covering the issues the policymakers needed. So we developed a couple of new surveys. The Business Impact Survey was up and running, and the first results were published within 10 days of lockdown being announced. The following week, we published a household survey, a new weekly survey of what people were thinking and how they were behaving. And then the following month launched the pilot for the COVID infection survey, which of course started as an English pilot and grew rapidly both in scale and coverage, and is now a key element feeding into the government's COVID response. The monthly Faster Indicators Bulletin became a weekly. We started with 3 indicators. We publish, for those familiar with it, a lot more now, and we're continuing to add to that list. We provided financial transactions analysis of basically card payment spend on a weekly basis across government, and particularly for number 10 in the Cabinet Office. And if anyone is familiar with our website, a whole bunch of new analysis, data visualizations, maps, blogs, you name it. To give you an extent of what that reflected, we published 80% more outputs last year than the year before. So a big increase, not only in the range of data, but the sheer volume. And just flick through a few examples. Here's one from administrative data, which alongside the monthly labour force survey, we published the HMRC pay as you earn data, which is 1 month ahead of the LFS. And although it's subject to revision, it does give us a useful early indication of departments have drawn upon. This example is from the Department for Transport, and it's their daily road traffic indicators, quite a good measure of social distancing, for example. Financial transactions data. We do receive financial transaction data from a number of providers. Unfortunately, we're not able to publish that at the moment, although we are negotiating with some providers to see if we can find a way of. We have been publishing this regular weekly series from the Bank of England based on their CHAPS credit and debit card purchase data, and it does show a similar trend to what other data suppliers are providing us with. And of course, commercial data. This is the Springboard Retail Footfall series. Again, a really useful indicator of the impact of lockdowns, different levels of restriction and policy, and how that's impacting on the retail sector. Now, those are just a few illustrative examples. There are a lot of other real-time indicators that we and others have been producing. And if you put those together with all of the COVID-related data that we, Public Health England, the Department of Health, etc., are producing, there's really a much, much richer and more comprehensive picture out there. Now, there are still data gaps, but nowhere near as much as we would have had if we hadn't responded in this way. And let's, of course, not forget the Business Insights and Conditions Survey, which continues to be published every fortnight and is giving, if not quite real time, certainly as close as we can get to real-time indications of how this pandemic has impacted on business. And then finally, just worth pointing out that many other national statistics institutes have responded. One of my favorites is Statistics New Zealand. They have a data portal that is updated weekly, which has over 80 data series across a wide range of measures. We are slightly envious that the 3 major banks in New Zealand were willing to provide them with regular data. And as you can see here from the monthly electronic card transaction activity series, which goes way back to 2002, that has some really excellent data. Something I think we probably would really aspire to if we can get there at the ONS. Now, let's talk about briefly opportunities and challenges. I think the use case for real-time indicators is fairly clear, but let's just run through a number of reasons why we might want them. One is simply timeliness. Official statistics are generally more accurate and reliable, but they take longer to produce. If you're in the middle of a national crisis and you need to know what impact your policies are having now, they're just not timely enough, although monthly GDP does help plug that gap. The pandemic also exposed major gaps in the evidence base and in data that we needed through one method or another to be able to answer some of those questions that policymakers had. We have also started using some of these real-time indicators to improve the quality of our existing official statistics and to independently validate their reliability. And some of these data, many of them are quite aggregated and only available on a daily or weekly basis, but others are much more granular and can give you additional insights looking at particular regions or industries or other demographic characteristics. And then finally, let's not forget that also, to the extent that we can, we want to make this data available for research. And the BICS survey, for example, after every fortnightly bulletin, we do upload that data and make it available on our secure research service for academic research. The point about timeliness is one that's been around for some time, and anyone working in government departments will know that ministers sometimes despair at the speed at which we can produce statistics. Real-time indicators provide a useful way of supplementing those official statistics and producing something that is more timely, but with important limitations to be aware of. Data quality is often poor and requires a significant amount of work to get them into a usable form. If we're receiving data from a third party, particularly commercial supply, it's really can be quite difficult to quality assure or validate those data sources. In many cases, you basically have to take them at face value. They may not always be representative. There are a number of areas, labour market is a good example, where there are a lot of different providers publishing slightly different versions of the truth, and all of them reflecting not the whole market, but just their market share, which may change over time and or may be subject to various biases, and one really needs to be aware of that. And there's a broader issue about statistical coherence. There's a lot of data out there telling broadly similar but not entirely consistent stories. There is a bit of work to be done to pull that together into a more coherent data picture. And it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the data that we're using is unstable. Its definitions and scopes may change. We often have very little control over that. And that does provide challenges, certainly for statistical organisations such as the ONS. To give you an example of the sort of challenges, this is the monthly ONS vacancy series, the dark blue line, and the dotted and dashed lines are two alternative online job ad series. Now, as you can see, they both broadly follow the same direction as the ONS series, one better than the other. And they're catching slightly different versions of the truth. And I think there is a bit of work to be done to identify which of the various data sources out there, particularly in those areas where there are a proliferation of data, are more reliable, or indeed whether there may be a case for aggregating or averaging out some of those results to come up with a more robust kind of measure. Many operational challenges, the two key ones I'll point out to data security, and also the fact that it's often not possible to make some of those underlying series available either to the public or for wider research and analysis. And some of you will be familiar with George Box's quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think the same could be said of real-time indicators, that they're all capturing a version of the truth. Very few of them are comprehensive and match the sort of reliability and accuracy of official statistics, but they certainly do meet timeliness and relevance considerations and can be useful alongside official statistics and other data sources. So just quickly to wrap up now, where do we go next? Firstly, let's reflect on what we've learned so far, and I stress that these are my personal reflections. The key drivers here are timeliness and relevance, which is a different kind of approach than statisticians are used to. They tend to focus more on accuracy and reliability, but certainly real-time indicators have been very useful to plug data gaps and provide new insights. And the approach that we found that works, which again is not the standard approach for official statistics, is to build something that is good enough and then iterate and improve it over time. As I said before, we need to be a little bit discerning. Not all real-time indicators are equally useful. Mostly complementary, although some could potentially substitute or replace official statistics. And what we found is really important to engage with users and stakeholders to explain statistics and real-time indicators. They often can't be taken at face value, and they often do require some explanation. Many of them have odd statistical quirks, such as Easter effects and all sorts of other seasonal, within month, within week biases that need explanation. It takes time and effort to work on those relations and secure regular access to a lot of the data sources we use. And that's as much about building a relationship as it is around the data itself. It takes a village to bring RTIs to the public. A wide range of skills are needed, including legal, corporate data science, analytical, etc. And it's been a real team effort at the ONS to get to where we've got to. And of course, there's a lot of really good things happening internationally that we ought to be drawing on and where appropriate, emulating. And one other point, some government departments have been sitting on very useful management information, been reluctant to make it public. To some degree, we have overcome those obstacles, but a few areas still remain where openness and transparency are not the sort of core approach that are being taken. So there's a bit further work to be done there. And then just finally, next steps. I think now is a good time to hold this conference, take stock and build on recent gains. I've talked before about the need for improving coherence. And I think we really ought to be pushing hard for an open by default approach to government management information, and also tackling the obstacles that still remain on sharing administrative data. And then finally, I think given that work program or tasks ahead of us, this area merits further investment to develop that suite of policy relevant real-time indicators. And then finally, let's not forget to thank our data suppliers and our colleagues across government who've worked to produce these indicators to such good effect, including, of course, my colleagues at BIES. I'll leave it there and close that presentation, and hopefully there's time for a few questions.
Thanks, Grant. That's really useful. So glad you could join us. Thank you to George as well for the presentation. I think we could probably squeeze in just one question before we close off. The next session is at 12. So let's go. So there's one question here. Grant, the ONS COVID-19 infection survey has been incredibly useful for scientists and policymakers during the pandemic. As politicians are advising we live to learn with the virus, are you planning on continuing this survey in the long term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not actually my domain, so I'm not as close to this as some colleagues at the ONS. There have been discussions with the Department of Health who commissioned the survey from us as to what the ongoing role of the ONS will be in not just this area, but sort of broader public health surveillance. I'm not sure that those discussions have concluded, but there may well be a continuing role for the ONS in providing some of that data, but obviously we would do that in cooperation with Public Health England and the department.
Thanks, Grant. Just squeeze another one in. I think you answered most of this in your one of your slides. Beyond the pandemic, are there any risks in providing real-time data or examples where it might not be appropriate? Is there a risk that key stakeholders miss out on the longer-term context?
Yeah, and that goes to my point about explanation, that you can't really take many of these indicators at face value. They need interpretation, and they certainly need an awareness of their limitations. And one would not want to be over-reliant on any particular indicator, because at any moment, the continuity of that supply could stop, or the structure or definition of the data that's being used could change. And we have seen that already with some of the indicators that we've been using. So they should all carry a health warning. But go back to George Box, all real-time indicators are wrong, but some have proven very useful, particularly at a time like now with the need to plug some of those data gaps as part of the pandemic response. So take everything with a grain of salt. Any good researcher or analyst would probably look at a range of sources and try and work out what the overall trends or patterns in that data is, rather than relying on solely on one of those indicators.
Brilliant. Couldn't agree more with you there, Grant. Let's go over to the second presentation. So we have George Papailias. He's head of banking and finance group, and also the director of data analytics for Finance and Macro Research Center, who's going to tell us about assessing the economy using the ONS faster indicators. I see some predictive stuff coming on here as well. So yeah, can I invite George to come on?
Yes, thank you very much, Luke. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, George, yes.
Let me just try to share my screen if I may. Let's get there. Can you see this?
I can see yep, we can see the slides.
Okay, I hope you can see all the slides. So welcome everybody. It's a bit of a change in presenter. My colleague Fotis Papailias could not be here with us today, so I'm going to do the presentation of our results. The first thing to say is that these are very preliminary results. This is work in progress. And before I start discussing the content, let me give you a bit of a background. So this is work that followed earlier work I did with Fotis, where we looked at some earlier versions of the faster indicator datasets that were available through the data hub at the ONS, and we tried to see how we could enhance forecasts produced with standard time series models when we included these datasets. And we found that they can indeed add some value. And of course, when the pandemic came around, we thought to try to see whether this value added continues to be the case in this new era. So we redid our analysis, and we started a project with the data teams at the ONS, not only to consider whether these indicators in their simple format, essentially aggregating the data using things like vacancies. I'm going to discuss more details about the data sets in a moment, but also to try to introduce some new methods. And this is to try to whet some appetite. And this is the kind of next steps in our analysis. We want to use some machine learning methods, neural nets, random forests, and so on, and also try to consider some unstructured data, some of the raw data. But that's to follow. And in fact, we believe that this might be the more interesting part of our analysis, and that we have some evidence for that because we've done quite a lot of work at the Bank of England using essentially faster indicator type of data sets, and using machine learning and using disaggregation, and we find that this really helps. But without really jumping ahead, this is the first step. We're looking at simple time series models. We're looking at things like principal components and autoregressions to see if including the faster indicator data sets can help us predict better. And indeed, we find there is some evidence that they do help us. So let me just move on. We have a couple of slides here stating the obvious, stating that the COVID has really upended pretty much everything. So we need to start thinking about how to forecast, what kind of data to use in this kind of new framework, in this kind of new environment. And we know that the ONS has been putting a lot of emphasis in producing more and more and different kinds of data sets, kinds of rich data sets to aid with the current conjuncture. We know that, for example, the Bank of England has been using these kinds of data sets to incorporate them into their models to produce more accurate forecasts. And this particular piece of work has, as I said, it's a first step, but it has two aims. The first aim is, as we say in this slide, to produce a coincident indicator of economic activity. The idea is that let's aggregate some of those data sets and let's construct something that tells us what's happening in the economy. We're being particularly vague about that, and I take it as a good point from the previous presenter, that we need to know exactly what we're doing here. However, we're not the first to be blamed for perhaps of being vague. There's a number of indicators that do not necessarily clarify what exactly they're trying to measure. And at this point, what we are simply saying is that we are summarizing with essentially principal components, a straightforward technique. We're summarizing these data sets and we're producing, and we're looking at this summary, and we're trying to see whether this summary is interpretable, is providing some ideas about where the economy is, or maybe where the economy is heading. But because indeed we do understand that this is reasonably vague, we also try to be a bit more structured. So we take these data sets and then we incorporate them in forecasting models. These models have particular characteristics and particular invite particular comparisons. So we could be adding things like lags because we know that lags do help forecasting in normal periods. And we do compare it to other kinds of data sets, and we try to see whether it does better, it is comparable, essentially how it can help. So that's the topic of this presentation, and I hope I'm not being too slow. I have only a quarter of an hour. So here is the outline of the presentation. I think I've discussed the introduction and motivation. We're trying to see whether faster indicators add forecasting value. I'm going to talk about the data. I'm going to present the indicator, which, as I said, is potentially interesting to see, is potentially valuable for a kind of first pass of an analysis. And then we also do some forecasting using time series models. And then we conclude. So that's what we're looking for. Here is a set of recent, I mean, we're not going to be we're going to be very selective here in terms of all the work that has been done in terms of forecasting under COVID. And we know that there is huge amount of work doing all sorts of exploring all sorts of different ideas. And here we're just giving some selection. We also see that there is some work using models from the machine learning literature to improve forecasting. And we do see that there is some evidence that you gain forecasting ability, for example, using machine learning methods. And as I said, this is on our to-do list. In fact, using different kinds of data sets, text-based data, we do realize in separate work for the Bank of England that we do get improvement. But I'm not going to discuss that today. I'm focusing more on this simpler analysis. So the question, as we address in this slide, is it only about using new methods? Is it only about using new models, or should we be also considering these new data sets that are available? So as we say here, in the first instance, we take a step back from complicated methodologies and we focus on these new data sources. I'm going to skip that slide and let me go to discuss the data we're using. So in the first instance, we have data on things like company incorporations. So this is the kind of faster indicators that we will be faster, more frequently available data that will allow us to construct our indicator. So that's one. We have also, and this will turn out to be quite a useful data set, the weekly job advertisements. This has been available for some time now, since February 2018. So that's actually a data set that will turn out to be quite a powerful addition to our forecasting toolkit. Companies, vacancies. We have here another set of larger data set, VAT indices, credit card. All of these things are, either being made available or will be available, and we think that this can also help. What we want, though, is we want to compare these new data sets to standard data sets. So essentially, for those of us who have been working on forecasting with what we used to call large data sets, we're talking about data sets of, I don't know, 50, 100, 150 variables, which could include real activity, which could include financial variables, which could include nominal variables, prices, and all of these things you would analyze using factor analysis. You would extract things using principal components. And I'm not going to be very fancy in terms of methods here. We know that there is, partial least squares, machine learning, VAR type analysis. You have many ways in which you can summarize these standard large data sets. And of course, we could consider applying all of these methods to the new data, the faster indicators that I am that I have in the second bullet point there. But we're not going to do this. We are going to start with a simple set of methods. We know that principal components have been tested more than any other method to summarize larger data set in econometrics and in economic forecasting. And that's what we are focusing on here today. So we're trying to see, first of all, how does it look in terms of producing a simple indicator? And secondly, how does it forecast compared to the faster indicators? How do they forecast compared to the standard data set I'm describing here? We do have a number of data issues. So we know that the faster indicators, there is only limited data availability here. So we do at the moment only consider data sets that have a reasonable background of data, enough data for us to construct our principal component, for us to carry out our principal component analysis. Obviously, there is a trade-off between how far back you go and how wide your coverage of those faster indicator data sets is. And we could consider methods that would allow for a variety of filling out missing observations. And again, there's a lot of work to be done there. As I said, this is very preliminary. In terms of what we are targeting, we are looking at the moment at the gross value added time series. So that's what we're focusing on. That's our target. And we could consider many other different macro variables, and that's part of our plans going forward. Essentially, what we're doing here, we are doing some preliminary analysis. We are collecting data. We are doing some seasonality adjustments, and then we're simply extracting factors. And in this way, we are constructing our coincident indicator. And that's the first type of analysis we do. But as I said, we're also doing nowcasting using models. And we are considering a number of different specifications for our regression type forecasts. I'm going to give more details in a moment. Once we do this kind of regression analysis, we're using standard metrics for evaluating this, root mean square forecast errors. Again, nothing fancy. This is about letting this new data speak. And as I said, we know that by using more sophisticated methods, we can leverage the ability of this data set to do better forecasting, and this is to follow. Here's a picture. Here is our real-time coincident indicator of economic activity. Actually, we're looking here at the factor loadings. We're looking here at how the construction of the principal components and the loadings is working through time. We're having a rolling graph of those factor loadings. And here is actually the indicator of economic activity. We are looking at it in terms of how it compares with our target variable GVA. As you can see from the later part of the sample, there is a reasonable there is a reasonable tracking of the actual time series. But that, as I said, is as much as you can do by simply doing a construction of a summary indicator. What we're keener on, and this is an interesting question, an interesting trade-off between having something that's easily digestible, that's easily understood by the layperson, as opposed to something that might actually produce a slightly better forecast. Actually could be a bit more informative in terms of forecasting performance. And then we go to our table with the nowcasting results. So let me spend a bit of time discussing this table. So here we're looking at the extraction of a number of, of a set of different numbers of principal components. You can see here some panels, PCA 1, PCA 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is essentially including 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 principal components. The last panel is basically looking at the number of principal components that would explain 90% of the, give you an R squared of 90% essentially. So that potentially is a bit too high. We were trying to, there's no correct level of explanatory power. We chose that in the first instance. And then you have a number of qualifications in terms of the models. SD is standard data set. FI is faster indicator. FIJ is an indicator extracted, or rather is an extraction based on online job vacancies. And as I said, this is of relevance because it seems to have some quite good forecasting performance. We can also have a model that includes lags of our target variable. We started at including only one lag. Again, I am going to apologize for the fact that these are really, really simple models here we're looking at, and you can construct different lag structures. You can consider combining the standard data set with the faster indicators. There is so many things you can do. But sometimes, not only this can cloud an important conclusion, but it basically feels a little bit like data mining. So we're trying to give some simple snapshot of what the faster indicators can do in terms of forecasting performance. This is all results obtained during the COVID pandemic. So that is interesting in itself. And the numbers you see are relative root mean square forecast errors. Not huge improvements. So, numbers of 0.94, 0.96, 0.95. That in itself indicates that it is a struggle to beat simple models. This is relative to the AR1 model. So we're considering a very simple benchmark of an autoregressive model with one lag. And we do know that these models, even though they're very simple, they are quite hard to beat. So that's essentially what we're looking at here. We see that a number of these principal component-based predictive regressions can improve upon the autoregressive model. We see that we always, in those little sub-panels, the last line, the bold line, presents the best performing model within the sub-panel of using 1, 2, 3, etc. Principal components. And we do see that there is some improvement, not huge, but considerable. We could, of course, do things like testing for understanding whether this kind of improvement is significant or not. As I said, these are preliminary results, and we will be doing a lot of that going forward. So at the moment, I'm going to stop by remaining on the nowcasting table, on the nowcasting results table, because obviously it's not the simplest of tables, and it's worth for people to kind of spend a bit longer looking at it. And as I said, our next steps are, rather than try to refine our analysis using potentially different, more standard time series model, perhaps based on VAR analysis, perhaps based on combining standard data sets. What we want to do is focus a bit more on newer types of model, on machine learning, on models that could potentially take advantage of any nonlinearities within the structure of the data sets we're looking at, and try to leverage that to produce better forecast. As I said, our experience from alternative large data set that was text indicate that there may be considerable value. You could be looking at the root mean square forecast errors of 0.7 as opposed to 0.9. Question is, all this analysis mainly goes down pre-COVID. Does it still apply to COVID? Would it apply post-COVID? These are all important research questions. I think I've overstepped a little bit, so I'm going to stop here. Luke?
Thanks, George. That's really interesting work. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions on the chat as well. So, George, there's a couple of questions on the chat here.
Should I?
So let's
Let me just
start
open the
with.
chat box, see if I can.
There's one about what data set did you use for online job vacancies, and did you find any biases in the data that might affect the forecast performance? Should we start there?
Yes, I have to say that, and I don't know whether there are people from the faster indicators team, but they may be better placed to tell us exactly what data we got. We've been given a kind of structured data set that we could then include into our both into our coincident indicator construction. But at the moment, what we did experience is that actually this was surprisingly informative. Now, and I would go back to say something more about the next steps. We would like to get the disaggregated data set, which we did not get. We got some aggregation. We would like to get a disaggregated data set. I mean, that gives me an opportunity to discuss perhaps the next step, where we are essentially would like to allow for all sorts of different cuts of the raw data, all sorts of different, aggregations, as it were, because that's what we did with text analysis in our Bank of England work. And we did find that rather than using simple aggregations, by allowing for different ways to incorporate this data into high dimensional regressions, we really got a boost in forecasting performance. To give an idea, in that particular setting, we constructed 8,000 different time series. And we took all those 8,000 different time series and we included them both in linear penalized models, like, we used lasso, we used other forms of regression penalization, but we also included neural nets, random forest, and support vector regressions. And we did find that just including a large data set increased performance considerably, and including the nonlinearities coming from these machine learning methods improved things yet more. So obviously completely different data set, but we do hope that you're going to get some sort of improved performance by doing this. So there is a question about how, there was a question about seasonality, and on that I have to say we haven't done really anything sophisticated. We've used some standard seasonality filters. Again, I think that might be worth exploring, in the sense that we may want to use some of these machine learning neural nets and so on, both on seasonally adjusted and seasonally adjusted data, and actually see whether you're actually improving things by allowing for some sort of bespoke for some form of bespoke seasonality adjustment that is done within the machine learning. But we haven't really played too much with this kind of adjustment. We use standard seasonality adjustments. In terms of how these were used, at the moment, we are now discussing about having these kinds of, there's two things. First of all, there is the indicator. And at the moment, this is just about a simple summary of what the data say. Then, of course, we would like to suggest the use of the forecasting model as a way to inform policy. And this is more about what is done at the Bank of England, where the text analysis that we did using similar methods has fed into some sort of policy considerations, but not much more than that. So I wouldn't be able to say much more than that. So in terms of benefits and drawbacks of principal component analysis in the context of the research, I guess I would go back to say that, principal components is a tried and tested method. It the basic, in my mind, disadvantage of it is that, and I can see Grant is on, and the basic disadvantage of it is the fact that it's not targeted. So when you extract a summary, you are not targeting that extraction with respect to a particular target variable. And this may or may not matter. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Big thank you to Grant and George. We are going to close this session now. The next session is at 12, so I presume you just stay on the call, But final thank you to Grant and George.